I've conducted this study because I'm concerned about a flyer that's been making its way around the internet. It says, did you know that the letter J is only 600 years old? So how could Jesus, who lived 2,000 years ago, be named Jesus? On the surface, this seems like a rather simple question with an equally simple answer, so most people would probably just dismiss it as being plain silly, I guess. Unfortunately, there are people who actually believe this, and they believe it because it has an element of truth to it. And the element of truth is that the letter J is approximately 600 years old or less. Half-truths are always more difficult to disprove than out-and-out lies. I've done a bit of investigating, read a few books. The list of books are at the end of this PowerPoint presentation, and I'm doing a series on the name Jesus and the letter J. The English language has a very long and complex history, and English has been influenced by many other languages. Old English, Middle English, Early Modern English, and Modern English have been influenced by Latin, German, French, Greek, and Romance, which is a group of Roman languages. Old English was influenced by German, German was influenced by Latin, Latin was the official language of Christianity, and it was also the legal language in its day. Understanding the origins of the English language is paramount to this study because it affects the way in which we understand and read the Bible. Ultimately, our goal is to find out how the letter J ended up in the name Jesus. Before we start, we're going to take a quick look at the history of the English Bible. Not all Bibles are listed here. For example, the Wycliffe Bible is not listed here because it's just not relevant to this study. The first Bible was translated from Hebrew and Greek manuscripts into Latin by Jerome, an early church father, in 382 AD. It was called the Latin Vulgate. Vulgate because vulgar was the common Latin of the day. Jerome was a Greek scholar, learned Hebrew, and obviously knew Latin, Vulgar Latin. The next major translation was done in the German language by Martin Luther. Luther completed the German translation of the Bible, the New Testament, in 1522 AD and the Old Testament in 1534 AD. The Bible that's most relevant to our study is the William Tyndale Bible in English, 1525 the New Testament and 1531 the Old Testament. As you can see, William Tyndale's dates are very similar to those of Martin Luther. They were both writing about the same time. William Tyndale introduced some new words and phrases in the Bible, like Jehovah for the name of God, and we're going to see why he did this very shortly. You might be surprised that he was the first person to use the word Passover, scapegoat, phrases that we still use today in the English language. My brother's keeper and salt of the earth, etc., came from William Tyndale. He was tried for heresy and burnt at the stake in 1535. He had a falling out with King Henry VIII. There's a picture here of a part of the Tyndale Bible, and as you can see, the English looks very different to our modern day English. The word beginning is very long, and gospel looks like instead of an S, it has sort of an F. So English has changed considerably over time, and if you looked at one of these older Bibles, you most likely wouldn't be able to read it. Tyndale's Bible was not the first English Bible. I mentioned that earlier, but it was the first to use the letter J in the history of Bible translations. That's as far as I can tell, unless somebody can prove otherwise. But of course, by now the letter J had made its way into the English language. So where did it come from? It's important to note that Tyndale was influenced by Martin Luther, who was German. Now, German words beginning with H and J sounded like Y in German and vice versa. Coincidentally, it's about this time that we begin to see the J being used for the Y sound in the Bible. The Y sound is a very Hebraic sound, a Yahweh, Yehoshua, Yehuda, etc., and they were translated into J words in the Tyndale Bible. We need to understand that translators don't just translate, but translators also transliterate. They transliterate because they give us the closest letter, the closest sound, or the closest word or phrase to the original language. They don't mean to deceive us in any way, they just do the best they possibly can. The J sound, not the letter, but the sound, was already in the English language. The letter J was incorporated into the English alphabet sometime in the 14th century. Now, prior to that, the letter I had the J sound. So it's not like the English language didn't have a J sound. It did have a J sound. It's just that it was represented by the letter I. So J evolved from I, kept its own sound, and I became a vowel and got a new sound. And that part of the flyer, of course, is a lie because they're telling you that there was no J. In the 11th century, which is the Middle English period, the Normans conquered England and the French language influenced the English language. Most people by this stage were bilingual. The French speakers emphasized the J sound in the French accent, and I'm not going to say it because it's most likely I will mess it up. That sound was then adopted by the French speakers, and J was a variant of I and was used interchangeably with I. It is estimated that in this Middle English period 10,000 French words were added to the English language. That is a lot of words. I just want to go back to our translations for a second and say this, that even though the early translations of the English Bible were written during the Middle English period, they were still highly influenced by the Old English, which was influenced by German, which was influenced by Latin. This was still apparent in the next translation, which was the King James Authorized Version, 1611 AD. That is an Old English Bible, even though it was written in the Middle English period and the very late Middle English period. You have to place where the English is coming from. So the King James Bible is the Old English Bible. By the way, 80% of the King James Version is the same as the Tyndale Bible. The early modern English period, the 15th and 16th century, saw the biggest changes to the English language. Latin still continued to influence the language, and so did Greek and Roman. It is estimated that 30,000 new Latin, Greek, and Romance words were added to the English language. The other major changes was the emphasis on vowels. Vowels became longer and more pronounced and more used. I would suggest you listen to somebody like Professor Michael Drought, who is a world-leading expert on the English language and how it evolved. Professor Drought says that in the 1400s, the Black Death gave rise to a new middle class in Britain. About half of the British population died because of this plague, he estimates anyway, and this new middle class emerged with new ways of speaking English. And this is one of his theories. He says it didn't happen all at once. He thinks perhaps over 50 years or so it might have happened. And most scholars, of course, refer to this, like him, refer to this as the Great Vowel Shift. So if you're doing anything on the English language, it would be hard to not read about the Great Vowel Shift. The 15th century also gave rise to the printing press in Gutenberg, Germany, 1450, which pretty much revolutionized the English language, and therefore there's plenty more to talk about in the next session. But for now, I hope I've given you some idea about how English evolved. Before I do the next session, I just want to say that yes, the letter J was a late addition to the English language, but prior to that, the letter J existed as a sound and was written as the letter I. Then the letters J and I were used interchangeably for a period of time. Eventually they would split and J would become a consonant and I would become a vowel. And that is the problem that I had with that flyer, and that is that it wasn't the truth and it wasn't a total lie, but it was some sort of a half truth.